Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Louise McGrath, General Manager for International Competitiveness here at the Australian Industry Group. And welcome to this afternoon's webcast on COVID-19, strategic threat or opportunity. So today I'll be moderating, and then we'll move on to a scene setting with Innes Willox, CEO of AI Group, who will give us a big picture view of what we're hearing from members and our partner organisations around the world, so what the world will look like post-COVID. Then we'll move into the crux of the webcast, which is planning to seize opportunity beyond COVID-19, and that will be delivered by Jane Cohen at KPMG. And at the end, we'll have about 10-15 minutes for questions. Now, I'd like to introduce Innes Willox, who's CEO of Australian Industry Group, who will take us through the big picture view. Innes.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and it's my pleasure to be here with you. I hope all's well in your businesses and that all are safe as well, and that's a very important first message. Apologies for the light I might be bathed in at the moment. It's very bright where I am. It's not where I usually do these Zoom broadcasts, so I hope you're not blinded by the light or blinded by statistics today. But thanks for joining us. Today, we've seen further evidence of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on Australia, and it is impacting the world as well. We saw today's unemployment figures come out, which showed that nearly 600,000 Australians had joined the unemployment queue in April, and there are now just around 6 million Australians on the JobKeeper allowance. While the unemployment rate nominally only went from 5.2 to 6.2%, that's masking the real pain in both workplaces and in the community more generally that COVID has wrought upon us very quickly. We've seen massive demand shock occur within the economy and occur very quickly. The brutality and the swiftness of the decline, I think, is what has surprised everyone. And from talking to government, they can point almost to the day in late March when things started to fall off a cliff, and sort of the ground was cut from under the economy very quickly. Of course, tourism, hospitality, retail, people-facing sectors were first impacted, but the ripples have now been felt through the economy as a whole. Perhaps best shown, apart from today's unemployment figures, with some data that AI Group keeps, the Performance of Manufacturing Index, an index that we've maintained since 1992. It declined from, in round figures, 52 to 35, the biggest decline in 1 month in the recorded history of the PMI. But also, apart from that biggest decline in a month, it was also the lowest number for manufacturing in Australia since the time of the financial crisis, August 2009. And that was a slower decline. This was a rapid, brutal decline in activity. And that through April takes into account that through March, where we got to that 52 number, we saw significant uplift across parts of industry to meet that pandemic panic buying that we saw at that time. So we then saw this massive decline. The only sector within industry which was expanding through April is across the chemicals industry, the chemical component. And that's really making hand sanitizers, cleaning products and the like. Everything else contracted. The other point to note there is that some of the leading indicators around manufacturing, the industrial base and heartland of Australia, that really showed concern was forward orders. And that went into a decline too, dropping significantly into real contraction territory. And that tells us, unfortunately, that this is going to be a long and protracted scenario that the Australian economy faces. There is unfortunately, no snapback. It will be a long process for our economy to regain its footing and to regain its feet. Forward orders usually run about 3 months ahead of the data, the actual raw material number that we get. And when a forward order number is down in the 20s, it tells you that we're going to be facing this situation for quite some time. There is real concern among our membership, among key parts of our membership, that what we are going to see is not a V, not the snapback, but more like a very long, protracted recession occurring across the economy, and a situation where it will take a long time for businesses and workplaces to recover, with a real concern that we're actually going to, if not see a double dip, or then see another significant decline occur through that period from June to September and beyond. Because what we're seeing now are the pipelines for industry not filling. In fact, they're reducing, and to hear numbers from members that sometimes their forward order books are about 15% of what they were a year ago tells us that looking ahead is going to be very difficult. We're seeing areas like oil and gas and construction also quite clearly and demonstrably slowing at the moment, and they are what kept the economy going. In fact, we pushed very hard to keep all industry open in Australia, and when you look at examples from around the world, you'll see why that was such a wise decision, to at least give us a foundation to rebuild our economy from here in. Now, France, for example, had its economy contract by 27% in the first quarter of the year. They shut everything down. The best estimates that we've seen from Treasury and Federal Treasury in Canberra is if we'd gone through the similar scenario and shut down our economy totally, we would have had a 25 to 30% contraction in our GDP. That would have taken us decades to recover from. But we've managed to get through so far, but looking ahead, we're concerned about what the next 6 months look like, and that looks like it could be tough rowing indeed. As I said, we've had 6 million people now on JobKeeper. That program is due to expire on September the 27th, which is not that far away when you think about it in calendar terms. And what we're working with government is around how either it extends or continues in some form for particularly hard-hit industries. The reality is that those sectors of the economy that were shut down first will be the last to reopen, and you've seen estimates in recent days that international travel may not resume until 2023. It certainly will be a long way away. When domestic airline travel resumes in Australia, it will be in a much more subdued and contracted form than that to which we remember from early March. And that leads to other issues around the future of the economy. Freight is incredibly difficult and will be for a long time, and that is impacting on supply lines and supply chains. And that's the story we're hearing from around the world, is that supply lines and supply chains are being stretched and are being rethought and repackaged. A couple of interesting things to note. Of who's been most affected by this health pandemic, it's been industrialised economies. Think of the United States, where now tens of millions of people are on the unemployment queue. Think of Western Europe, that example from France of a contraction of 27% in their economy. Italy and Spain, they have, those sort of economies have been the hardest hit and the hardest impacted around the world. So this is why our economy has really been buffeted in a big way. What we're seeing out of this too is renewed activity from China. And I did a conference call on Tuesday night with our counterparts from around the world, from the UK, US, Canada, France, Germany, Turkey and the like. And the message was the same right around, is that China is playing a very active role in those economies, trying to assert itself into those economies, and to perhaps, while the Western world is being distracted, to manoeuvre itself into a more advantageous position. Australia is not alone in having tensions with trade with China, but we are perhaps one of the most exposed economies. And this is, as we saw in February, as China was in the depths of its problems with COVID-19, there was a lot of efforts at reshoring within Australia, or spreading risk among companies seeking to not become so reliant on one market, either for goods or one source for supplies. And this is a trend that we're likely to see. I look at it this way. We're in the first stage of dealing with this pandemic and the economic crisis. And you look at it as a three-stage process. The second stage is going to be severe unemployment, and we saw signs of that today, reduced business activity and low demand. They're the characteristics that will drive that second stage. The third stage as we move through will be low participation and a lack of skilled workers, a skilled workforce as business tries to retool and rework itself. But there will be continued low business investment, and at the same time we need to go through a process of building resilience to future shocks. And that's the process that we've started already in conversations with governments, federal and state, around how do we build greater resilience into our economy. We think this will be a long process, but Australia is probably better placed than most to deal with what is ahead. We're now in the process in Australia of beginning the process of returning to work. A lot of businesses kept working, but blue-collar workforces have stayed the course. It's a white-collar workforce starting that return to work process. A variety of ways that businesses are doing that, dividing into teams, splitting shifts, one-way corridors, getting rid of hot desking. All of these are strategies that businesses are taking up. The big concern we've seen and heard from members is from their workforces concerns around getting to work. Public transport in particular is an area of big concern and something that needs to be addressed. There's sort of confidence that employers will handle it, but it's the getting to and from work, which is a significant issue for workforces. And we've all seen a quite significant shift towards a preparedness to work from home, which is obviously going to impact on how we work into the future. So this COVID-19 crisis has thrown us a lot of curveballs at a macroeconomic level, at a microeconomic level. We're going to see governments have to spend more on recovery packages. We're seeing a lot of conversations around policies such as tax, skills, regulation, energy, and workplace relations as key drivers to get the economy out of this. And I'm happy to answer any questions about those later. But this has challenged us at a high level, and then also at that workplace level as well, as we seek to rebuild confidence. But we now have another 600,000 people on the unemployment lines. We have 6 million people on JobKeeper. We have people on reduced hours and reduced wages on top of that. So we cannot underestimate the impact that this crisis has had on our economy. There is no doubt about it that we will be going into recession, and a significant recession, and the policy questions that we're looking at, how do we start to dig ourselves out of that? But we are better placed than most to begin that process, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. Louise, at that point, I'll hand it over to you, but that's sort of a big picture scenario of how we're seeing things unfold at the moment.
Great. Thanks, Innes. And as Innes said, we'll have some time for questions at the end if you want to clarify any points and you've had time to digest. I'll now pass on to Jane Cohen from KPMG, from their strategy team, who will be taking us through the rest of the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me, and in particular to AI Group for giving me a reason to put lipstick on today. So thank you very much for that. I am a partner in the KPMG strategy practice with a particular focus on consumer product services and retail, but also cover some other industries. But clearly retail is one of the hardest hit industries as a result of COVID-19. And so what I thought I would do is talk to you about an approach, but apply that into the retail context. So at KPMG, we've been actively looking for insights from other times and places to help our clients look ahead and prepare for the post-COVID-19 economy. So in these uncertain times, you know, there is no, is no roadmap for what's going to come ahead. And so what we've been trying to do is look at other examples, also look into China and other countries that are a little ahead of us to understand what's going on to help our clients plan. But one very clear lesson, in particular from the GFC globally, is that companies that mastered the delicate balance between cutting costs to survive and investing in the growth opportunities that will precipitate from such a major disruption to our economy outperformed the market over the following decade. So what we wanted to do was try to help you think about how to frame up what that future might be when everything is still moving. In particular, I just wanted to point out a couple of examples for that. So Amazon, at the time of the GFC, was still largely an online bookstore. And as a result of the GFC and seeing the opportunity there, they moved into multi-category play. And by 2009, sales had grown 28%, and the general merchandise category exceeded book sales for the first time by 2009. So it just shows the opportunity. And another one in retail is Costco. In 2008, they looked at rationalising their store network and in particular rationalising their SKUs, which has been the backbone to the success of Costco's strategy. From there, and they still maintain a much fewer SKUs. So they have about 3,700 SKUs compared to the competition that on average will have 60,000 SKUs. And that's been the recipe for their success. And of course, we saw a lot of startups and disruptors happen at that time. So how to do that? Maybe on the next page, thanks, Louise. There are multiple horizons to think about, and if you know the McKinsey approach to strategy, the 3 horizon strategy, look, it's no different. That is how you should be thinking about strategy in this environment. We do have an extra horizon though, ground zero, horizon zero, which was to deal with the immediate safety crisis that first hit business. But what we're recommending to our clients is to focus on 3 horizons, all in parallel. So that approach to strategy is somebody's thinking about tomorrow, somebody's thinking about next week, and somebody's thinking about next year. And that is what we would propose. Now, who leads those conversations varies slightly. So for Horizon Zero in the crisis, it has to be CEO-led and it's very safety-focused. In Horizon One, or the resilience phase, it's about restoring operations so you have a viable service model in the crisis period, so it's through shutdown. That's largely a finance-led conversation, very focused on cash. Second horizon is where we are today, which is to start to think about what the known risks and opportunities are as a result of the crisis and adapt to that future. So example there in retail is absolutely amping your e-commerce strategy and supplementing your capacity in e-commerce. And then Horizon 3 is what is that new reality? Will the business model actually suit and be fit for purpose in that new reality? Will there be new customer segments or new customer needs? You might have to make significant changes to your basic value proposition to compete. And that's a growth-focused, strategy-led conversation. And again, in this situation, it's hard to look too far out, but to think about how it could really amplify between 12 months and 3 years' time. And have something that's quite adaptive so that as the world changes and evolves, you change that strategy with it, because we'll just, seeing this playing out live. On the next page is to touch on some of the points that Ines raised. This is no sequential experience. This is going to be a series of shocks, and they're going to come from 3 different directions. So firstly, just conceptually on the left-hand side there, we have the health crisis as the red line, and there might be multiple waves. With the Spanish flu, the second wave was worse, a lot worse than the first wave of the health crisis. That could occur. In addition to that, we now have a financial crisis, and that financial crisis is going to bounce off the health crisis. And so that's adding to it. Now, we believe at this point that financial crisis from the chief economist at KPMG is going to bottom out in June, July, as we can see the market at the moment. But as Ines said, absolutely, this is no bounce back. And for some parts and some categories, it's going to be a lot worse. And there will be some parts of the economy that do bounce back, but it's going to vary depending on how the stocks are. And in addition to that, again, as Ines was talking to, we now have a geopolitical crisis that has been growing and growing, and just overnight with the discussion about beef trade. It started with the oil crisis, the new kind of oil conversations, and just last night is now about beef with China. This is going to keep playing out, and then that's going to impact supply chains, customer channels, etc. And those three crises will continue to bounce and play out. It's going to be a rocky road. So what we're suggesting on the right-hand side is we did lay out that sequential process, but actually you're going to have to think about each of these horizons continuously, possibly for 18 months. You'll need some kind of war room approach. So you have a group of people in the centre that are watching how each of those crises is playing out and identifying when it's time to think as an organisation whether you should respond to it. And then you have people thinking about tomorrow, next week, next year, constantly adapting those plans. And they all need to be talking to each other, because if you make a decision about tomorrow that cuts your nose off for, next year, you want to be having that conversation. So, some companies in the absolute crisis were talking about cutting their investment in e-commerce. Now, obviously, at that point, they hadn't really thought the whole thing through, and they changed those plans very quickly. But that's what can happen if you don't have all horizons talking at the same time. So just on the next page is to shift towards, okay, how do you think about strategy at that horizon 3?
So just to interrupt, Jane, we have a question from Mick Bowen-Payne. I think Molly will unmute Mick. No? All right. Hang on. I'll ask Mick what the question is, and then you keep going, Jane.
Okay, can you just flick to the next page? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so how to start thinking about strategy. This is a really confusing slide, and it actually represents how it feels at the moment. But what we suggest you do is identify all of the underlying trends that you think could happen. And there are lots of papers out here, and there's a link that will provide you on KPMG's view on what some of these big macro trends could be, which we've got here as these dots as examples. For example, offshored operations will be reevaluated, as Ines had already alluded to. So identifying all those possible trends, and then it's really important to prioritise, because you'll be so confused and you won't be able to get a plan that can cover off on all of those uncertainties. So on the y-axis, to think about the relative impact of if that trend played out, how important is that to the returns in your business? Let's take out the things that have lesser impact on your business for now. And then going along the x-axis, then thinking about how certain are we that those trends will play out. So top right are your strategy drivers. So these are things that are going to have a big impact, and you're pretty sure they're going to happen. You should be planning around those now. So buying behaviours will remain unchanged is one of the high-level kind of macro trends in there. Absolutely, you need to get a point of view about that and design your strategy around that. on the top left are scenario drivers. So these are things that will really impact your business, but you're really not sure how they'll play out and when they'll play out. So if you build that base strategy, then you build these scenarios alongside it and develop a plan for how you might pack along that strategic pathway if these scenarios play out. So sort through them, make sure you put as many as possible in the car park. You don't need to be distracted, especially in boardrooms. I find that, everybody's got a slightly different lens on the problem, which is fantastic. Collate that, pull it all together, but then explicitly say which ones you're planning around and get everybody on the same page about what future you're planning for. On the next page is then to make this very specific to your industry. So with all of those macro trends, build them up. Like, how could they all play out together, and write out what scenarios, how they could play out for your industry and your business. So here are 10 examples from the retail industry that we've been talking about a lot. The first one is the step change in e-commerce. So for this scenario, it would be to say how bad, or it's not bad, but how significant could the change be? So at the moment in Australia, it's about 9% penetration of retail sales online. What if that doubled? And you might have another scenario, what if it tripled? I'll go through the dark blue ones. Mindful consumerism. So there's, with this experience that has been completely immersive for consumers, where they've been forced to stay home and slow down, they are finding different ways to spend their time, and they're realising that actually they didn't need a lot of those material things that they had before, and they might even be happier. We believe that there will be a shift towards more mindful consumerism. So it's not that people will not buy, it's that they want to know where the product's been made, who's been impacted by it, and do they really, really need that? Is that going to add to their quality of life? Is it necessary?
Do you think, Jane, this came up at a B20 meeting and sharing ideas? There was a point made that consumers are really watching at how companies navigate through this crisis. So it's part of the mindful consumerism. They're watching how companies deal with their workers, deal with the community, and how competent they look as they move through. Do you think that's part of this mindful consumerism?
Absolutely, and that has been in the focus of Horizon 2 in recovery. The companies that are really forward thinking, who had social concern about their businesses, like banks and many other services that have gone through royal commissions, etc., have really looked ahead and thought, hey, here's an opportunity to show our true purpose and that we really have changed, or we really do demonstrate those values. So Woolworths is an example where they created jobs for Qantas staff, and then just last night, I think Telstra announced that they were rolling out 5G faster, and in particular to parts of the country that didn't have sufficient internet capacity. So huge opportunity to lean in and build advocacy for brands. One last one I'll call out on this page is the safety experience. So we've been talking a lot about the importance of customer experience for many years and customer-led strategy. At this point, your customer experience is going to be your safety experience in retail. So there is a real risk that if some of these major shopping centres and retailers don't handle this transition as restrictions are lifted well, it will severely impact their brands. And it will be very difficult to recover. So you don't want to be on the front page, like Chadstone Shopping Centre and some of these shopping centres over the weekend, where it just looks like a circus. The risk is that consumers will think that's quite funny at the beginning, and then they won't come back. And the pain, living through that pain, will mean a lot of those businesses quickly run out of cash. And just the last one that I'm quite excited about is the rebirth of the village. I think we've all experienced the rebirth of community living and our local shopping village. And what consumers are telling us is they've really, really enjoyed that, and that could be something that sticks. So on the next page is just to make the point that it's not one size fits all. I mean, we know this, but it's good to write it down. And it's not one size fits all by industry, but also within industries. So, for example, major retailers like department stores have seen surging in some categories like fitness and toys, and they've seen a hard reset in terms of apparel and footwear. So you can't treat your whole business the same way. When you go through that process of identifying scenarios and then planning your way through that with a tool like wargaming, you need to break your business up into these different categories. And if you see the little bumps on the side of those quadrants, depending on where you sit, you will spend more or less time in those different horizons, thinking about how those horizons will play out. So in hard reset, you're already thinking about horizon 3, and that's actually all you need to think about because your business isn't really moving at this point. Whereas in surging, it's horizon 2, it's just how we're going to keep up. We need to keep up. So on the next page is so what? So as you go through this process and identify what could happen, you need to think about what decisions you'll make differently. So thinking about your whole of business, if you're a multi-business unit operation, what's the role of the centre? Do you play a bigger role actually through this crisis? Is that crisis centre set up in the centre, and there's one group that are looking ahead at all of those upcoming lead indicators on the 3 different crises, and then you provide that information to the business units? It just saves a whole lot of time. It's actually a valuable contribution that a centre can provide to their business units. How will you govern? Like, how are you going to set budgets and targets in this environment? Should you be thinking about divestments? And in fact, thinking about the opportunities here, are there investment opportunities that you'd like to start thinking through? And then your business units need to clearly think about their strategy, not just how to win, like what activities to do, but in fact, where to play. Are the most attractive customers still the same customers that you target? What's your financial plan and your operating plan? And then over on the right side is your project plan. So you need to go through that with a fine-tooth comb. You don't have as much cash and capital at the moment. What initiatives should be accelerating? Should you be stopping or pausing activities? And then thinking about the opportunities that are coming out of this. Are there some no regrets initiatives that you'd like to add, and some hedging initiatives that face into those scenarios? We're not sure how this scenario is going to play out. We're going to develop this kind of agile project, and if it goes this way, we're ready and we're already on that path. And I think my next page is my last, is the next steps. So how would we recommend you move through this process? As I spoke about at the beginning, setting up a multi-horizon war room and giving people clear horizons to think about. The second step would be to design those future state scenarios for your business and your industry. And then thirdly, wargame it. So this is where you'll have people, or you yourself, if you're a smaller business, take on the role of different stakeholders. So the community, your customers, your suppliers, and then think about how you will react to that scenario. And then within that, you will have played out how it could, an example of how it could play out, and you can work out your decision roadmap from there. So number 4 is to actually write down that decision path and the options you have, and then finally track metrics that will indicate which scenario you're heading towards. So yeah, we wanted to share that approach with you. We know it's a very busy time, and we're getting asked a lot by our clients on how to think about the future when it's all so uncertain. So thank you.
Karina Collins, also from KPMG, who can answer other questions. One question that I have is, in terms of the wargaming, and you've put up some of the big trends, but it can be difficult for companies, particularly SMEs, to get that data, to get those trends. We can put up some resources on the chat from Austrade in terms of what's happening overseas, and also from our partner, the US Chamber of Commerce in the US. They've got a dashboard of shutdowns right across the world. So Molly will put those in chat now. But Jane or Karina, what do you recommend as sources of information?
So actually, I did have another slide at the end which had some resources.
There we go.
Yeah, sorry, I've got that one. So thanks for reminding me. And there's a lot of material out there, and sifting through that material is difficult. So my recommendation would be to pick 2 or 3 sources of truth for your industry. So, and you might pick a range. Now, KPMG has quite a few publications, and we've been doing a lot of thought leadership work across many industries. So I've just got 3 here for you to share with you. Firstly, just this week, we released our new reality predictions for COVID-19, which is agnostic of industry. These are all big kind of trends that we see playing out. So definitely take a read of that, very recently released. And then, you can look at other consulting firms, but maybe you want to look at industry bodies, et cetera, and what they're releasing and saying, and bring all of that together and triangulate it for you. And then these 2 other thought leadership pieces we just put in because they're retail-focused thought leadership pieces. We had a look deeply into what's been happening in retail in China, as they're about 2 months ahead of us in terms of releasing restrictions on what's going on there. We talked to 6 big trends that we're seeing in China, so have a look at that. It also has just been updated to include some trends by category in retail. So some of those categories are looking like a U shape, some are V, some actually are just accelerating. Although it's a different context, it just gives you something to base your assumptions off. And the last one's around e-commerce that we've got there. But there's a lot of information available on the KPMG website, and also a lot focused on small businesses and that you could leverage.
Great, thanks. And also, in addition to the links Molly's put up on the chat, there's the AI Group economics page on our website, which has a lot of information, particularly obviously with manufacturing and construction and services. What are the trends? As Ina said, our PMIs are about 3 months ahead of the rest of the economy. So if you're looking for projections, that's a good place to start. So I might direct the next question to Ines. Ines, when when a number of the markets shut down, it did disrupt supply chains, and it really broke trust. What do you think companies can do with their suppliers or their customers to re-engage and to really build that trust?
It's a good question, Louise. I think, as I said earlier, the swiftness and the brutality of what happened really took a lot of people by surprise. And although it happened quickly, it did happen at different paces across the world, not that far apart, but different paces. And we had a lot of businesses and a lot of sectors completely shut down in some countries, New Zealand, for instance, and more close to home, and others stay open. So there was a mixed picture, and there was no one size fits all. I think in addition to what you were just saying, the data shows that I think about 75 countries have enacted border controls since all this began. So making it very difficult to deal with some countries as they've sort of closed themselves off, almost sort of walled themselves off in an old way. Look, the issue here is around is two things. It's rebuilding trust, but it's also diversifying risk. And that's what a lot of member companies of ours are talking about now as a lesson learned from this, is that we do have to find different ways of gaining supplies and of accessing new markets. And that was part of what Jane was talking about there, following the trends. But this is, I think that one of the big lessons out of this is going to be risk diversification. But a lot of this was beyond the control of some of companies. It was decisions taken at national levels to take steps, which has really impacted on the trust. Now, we see China getting up and running again, but as we're seeing in a lot of different markets, there's a lot of discontinuity in this ramp up, and there's a lot of stopping and starting going on. So we are going to see massive disruption for quite a long time to come, and that is why the risk diversification strategy is probably the most appropriate one, and one that a lot of our members are following or seeking to follow. We did see, as I mentioned, a lot of reshoring or attempts at reshoring when the early days of this hit. But the question we all have is how long that will last, that concept will last, and that preparedness to do that. This is where issues like price are going to come into account and be very important. But it's also the issue around proximity to customer and proximity to supplier, and they are going to be much, much more to the forefront of businesses' mind from all the information that we're gathering.
And I think, well, I'll ask you first, Innes, and then perhaps Jane to comment as well. Australia has navigated this relatively well. I think, there's a term being thrown around, the coalition of the competent. Do you think that will make a big difference for the brand Australia, which will then support Australian companies who are looking overseas?
I think so. I think so in the longer term, and I think, and just from the call we had with our global counterparts on Tuesday night, there was very much a recognition that Australia, for a variety of circumstances, had learnt from others, had taken our own steps, and had sort of balanced the health and the economic component of this very well. That there was a recognition that Australia had done it better than most. And there is this coalition of the competent. You see the Prime Minister on calls with them regularly now, sharing notes. But the point that the health officials make is that we're not through this yet, and there may be other waves, health waves to come. But it does help our reputation. We were in the middle of participating in a major relaunch of Australia internationally as a brand. A lot of work had been done on that through last year, on Australia, not just the clever country and the smart country, but also not just Australia as a beach and a quarry and a hotel, but it was about Australia and what it brought to the world. And as we come through this on the other side, I think the recognition of competence and skill at a national level will flow through to businesses. Should we allow that to occur? And I think that's certainly one of the big objectives here, is to learn at a national level, to learn what did we do well leading up to COVID-19, what did we do badly, and to amplify what we did well and to really minimise what we did badly in the past. So I think you're going to see a change in sentiment, and it's already occurring within the community and government, about the role of industry. And by that I include manufacturing, mining, agriculture, and the like, in being at the core of Australian identity going forward.
Jane and Karina, are you seeing that with your clients as well? Are they starting to leverage off that reputation?
I think it's a bit early to leverage. I think everything's looking like we are doing really well here in Australia, but in saying that, it's going to be a long game, and we saw how Singapore was looking great until it wasn't looking great any longer. So the good news is that we're in no better position than we could be. We're in the best position we could be, and hopefully we can continue that. And it is interesting, as Ines said, we learned from what was happening in other countries, and we actually asked other countries and built off that, where we have other examples like the UK and the US that actually probably thought they knew better than others and continued on. So it is, if it plays out well, this will be great for Australia.
Mm-hmm.
We sort of took the middle path, is what I'd say, and that will play out well. We didn't go into total lockdown like the US and the UK or New Zealand, and we didn't go the laissez-faire attitude either. Say that some have, others have. Sweden in particular is a classic example. So it's interesting talking to members who've dealt in New Zealand about, quite frankly, what a disaster that has been for them. In that terms of that New Zealand relationship. And, look, they might have come out of it well in a health sense, and very good luck to them for that too. It's very well played. But economically, I think there's a lot of questions about reliability, to your point, Louise, around trust that have been raised as a result of their handling of this.
Now, Jane, I think there must have been an acronym on one of your slides. What does ESG stand for?
Environmental and social governance, the environmental and social impact.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And Ines, there's another question for you. Do you have any view on how long health, finance and geopolitical crises will last? I might have said the WTO Director General has just announced his early resignation, so it may last longer than we think. But anyway, over to you.
Well, look, this is the $64 billion question, and probably $640 billion question, if not more. How long will it last? We're all looking into crystal balls here and trying to work it through. I think I have to be honest and say my projections are more sort of in that 3-year time frame rather than a year or 5 years. I think it's sort of in that period of around 3 years for a range of cycles to play through. We have to go through, as I tried to outline, sort of those 3 stages of recovery, and which end up with us building more resilience. But it won't be a simple equation, and it won't be linear either. We will probably get health setbacks, and we'll get economic setbacks on the way as well. I pointed to a lot of our members in industry looking 6 months down the track and really worried about what will be happening then. So it's dependent on what sort of support can be given from government. I'm not meaning in terms of funding or the like, but around policy support from government to get the economy moving again. And then, of course, what happens internationally. We are very much an exporting nation. And if we see a continued downturn in, say, the United States and Europe has had its worst quarter on record, as you'd understand. But if that lingers for a long time and there's no signs of recovery there, that will permeate through the global economy, and that will impact us quite significantly. So I'm sort of much more in the 3-year camp for recovery, and a clear sign will be when we're able to start flying again and travelling again. I think everyone's enjoyed not being on planes, except if you're working for Qantas or Virgin or other airlines, of course. But that'll be a sign that sort of economic activity is really resuming in a significant way.
Jane and Karina, another question. Where do you see the areas that technology will impact the most in the new normal? So obviously you've mentioned some in retail, but more broadly.
In terms of from a sector perspective, I'll probably let Jane talk to that, but absolutely in terms of when we look across the business model or the operating model, we're hearing a lot of organisations say now that COVID-19 has been their opportunity to actually lean into and progress their digital transformation programs at speed. So certainly in terms of as we're working with clients to plan for and anticipate those scenarios in the new reality, I'd say, Louise, the predominant areas are around the supply chain and making their supply chains much more smarter. So, how do we very quickly accelerate investments into digital technologies, robotics, AI, predictive analytics, etc., across and through supply chains. But of course, that also comes with, I think the other area would be how we're adopting digital technologies to enable our workforce sort of in a future to maybe not necessarily, return to the past norms, but probably lean into work practices with more mobility and flexibility around work practices would probably be the two areas that we're seeing definitely an uplift and a focus, and a lot of that scenario planning that Jane mentioned in terms of what that means for digital acceleration of digital investment.
Well, I just know from a very small area within our group, well, not small area within our group, it's small within the global economy. We issue export documentations. We always had to have people around to manually sign some documents for, which were demanded by foreign customs agents. Now everything's digital. We've worked with DFAT to make sure they're all accepted. Companies can now email the documents through, and I think it's really, we're not going to go back. That saves so much time and effort for all involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Ines, this might be another question for you. Does anyone have a view on what the focus areas will be by government to stimulate the economy over the next 6 to 12 months?
Sure, Louise. I think there's sort of key policy drivers that they're looking at. So let's just take that focus on self-reliance or resilience, however you want to describe it, within the economy. That's going to be an important area. So one of the very quick early lessons learned out of this from government has been that we were deficient in terms of healthcare provision, that is provision of PPE, protective personal equipment, ventilators and the like. All of that's become clear. So it's not the notion that we have to build everything here that is coming through, but rather that we have to have the dexterity or the ability to pivot industry. And that's going to be a key focus area for government. So that's one thing I'd say. Secondly is that the conversations have already started, and I have to stress that although we've had sort of great cooperation around what you might call the traditional institutional structures in Australia between business, government and unions, for instance, community groups and the like, environmental groups, through all of this, that is not going to, these areas that I'm about to outline are not going to remain uncontested for long, and certainly not forever. And you'll start to see sort of different arguments develop around these key areas. But from government's perspective, they're going to look at industrial relations and workplace relations, the award system, the enterprise bargaining system, the way that the Fair Work Commission operates. All of these issues are going to be up for discussion and debate, and in quite a deep form. They're going to look at tax reform, and that's just not corporate tax or company tax. It's the structure of our taxation system, looking at income tax, reliance on income tax, the way state taxes operate, payroll tax, land tax, stamp duty, work cover premiums, all of that. The whole tax conversation is very much up in the air at the moment. Regulation, a serious look at regulatory reform, duplication of regulatory reform and redundancy of regulation. And energy is going to be a big area that's going to be pushed as well, to push towards clean energy, gas remaining as a key driver of the bridge towards a cleaner energy future. Skills and training, big effort. You're going to see the government released last year what they called the Joyce Review into vocational education and training, and that will be that is the platform for more work on a revitalisation of skills and training in Australia, using TAFE, using private providers, using perhaps universities in a new way as universities have to restructure themselves going forward. They will be sort of the key drivers and platform of policy reform discussion. There's not much that can be done in terms of monetary policy. Interest rates are at 0.25%. They're not likely to move anytime soon. So it's really either left to fiscal policy or real reform measures. So there's the potential here, if we get the conversations right, that we can make progress here. I'd have to be honest, all this will be contested, and I'm already seeing signs of measures that are being put up for discussion being seriously contested, either politically or behind the scenes by other institutions like unions. We saw decisions today around agreements that have been, arrangements that have been reached around awards, just being they're being sunset claused at 12 months. So we've really bought ourselves 12 months for a serious reform discussion around those sort of 5 key areas that I outlined.
Louise, if I can just add to that, one interesting area that we're seeing with clients with the focus on supply chains and digitisation and new opportunities around manufacturing is the emergence around advanced manufacturing and what that actually means in terms of R&D and the policy around that. So we are starting to see some questions and some pressure open up towards government around reform of R&D policy as well, to open that up a bit more broadly.
Agree.
Great. All right, well, we've only really got time for one more question. I see in the chat someone has asked about happening in energy industry. There's some information on on the AI Group website, which Molly, if she's lucky, might find it and put it on the chat. So one last question on a point of positivity or optimism. Ines, where do you see are the key areas of opportunity?
It's a good question, and I sit on the National COVID Commission's manufacturing task force. That's clearly going to be an area of opportunity. That notion of value adding, moving up the value chain is going to be crucial as we sort of pivot, as I said, within industry. That's hadn't developed the ability to pivot. Energy will be a big opportunity. And it's an opportunity that we have looming now to not resolve, but at least for now put to bed some of the energy discussions that have bedeviled us for well over a decade now. There is an appetite to do that. If we get energy right, if we start to get gas policy right, for instance, then we'll be able to do things like develop new industries or reboot industries in Australia around, say, petrochemicals, for instance, just to pick that as one of many examples. But it would make it much easier if we can get some settlement around energy then for industries to have certainty to make investments. That's one key area. Look, the whole area around digitalisation and digital skills is digitalisation of industry is an enormous opportunity in Australia as industries reinvest and reboot. So I think that is going to be an area as we sort of reshape our economy going forward. That macro opportunity of Australia as a trusted partner is remained open for business and is led by example is also a big opportunity. A couple of things just on the horizon that we still need to get through globally. We still need to get through Brexit. We still need to get through a US election. These are all going to be big variables into the end of the year and how they impact on things. And just an interesting side note, I was talking with the Bankers Association yesterday, and they were saying they're still not seeing businesses take up the new credit lines being offered by themselves, even government-backed, at the extent to which they thought. So that's a sign that confidence is still low. So what we do need, where the opportunity needs to come, is to rebuild confidence within the economy to get businesses spending and to get consumers spending again. And that's where the opportunities will come. We will remake the tourism industry, for instance. That will be a different looking industry, probably much more domestically focused over the next 3 to 5 years than perhaps we've seen previously. That will be another opportunity. So I think there are an enormous number of opportunities, and the new normal will look quite significantly different to the old normal, but building on its strengths. And I think that's a very positive thing. So the one silver lining out of this is that it's sort of made everyone stop in a policy sense about old think and start to think about, well, how will our new economy look, and how do we create the jobs for those couple of million people who have been either thrown out of work or are now on JobKeeper. and who are in a quite precarious position sort of 3 or 4 months from now. So there is some urgency in this into developing those new opportunities along the sort of lines that I spoke of.
Great. Well, that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much, Ines, Jane and Karina. I'll just finish up. So as I said, this webcast has been recorded and will be emailed out to you along with a copy of the slides. And it comes to you under the banner of the Australian Industry Group's Big Hub, the Business Improvement and Growth Hub. This is a resource for all members. It has over 250 fact sheets, there's videos, checklists on all areas of improving your business, whether it's planning, process improvement, using new technologies, managing your environmental obligations, the circular economy, international business, right across. And of course, all members have free access to this just using your login. But for those non-members who are on the call today, we'd like to invite you to have a free trial. You can email big@aigroup.com.au. And members, if you think your customers or suppliers would also benefit from some business improvement tools, please do feel free to pass that offer on to them as well, and we'd be happy to look after them. So that's all. Thank you very much for joining us. The Australian Industry Group is a national industry association. We're here to support companies for today, but also thinking of the future, and that's part of the discussion today. And thank you to our panellists for a very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.